Ok. Bom dia a todos. Good morning, you all. Nós começamos, então, damos início à primeira das sessões do 15º Encontro de Estudos das Origens da Filosofia Contemporânea. É um prazer ter todos vocês aqui. Da mesma forma, todos aqueles que nos assistem pelo YouTube. Também agradeço a organização e na pessoa do professor Mário e desejo a todos um excelente encontro. Nesse momento, eu passo a palavra ao professor Mário Porta, que vai fazer a abertura e a introdução inicial, e depois nós passamos à apresentação do nosso convidado dessa primeira sessão e do seu debatedor. Professor Mário, bom dia.
Good morning, everyone. I am pleased to welcome you all to the 15th edition of the International Meeting of Studies on the Origins of Contemporary Philosophy, held at the Pontifical Catholic University of São Paulo. This event will be held in a hybrid format, online and in person. Every single day, there will be an international keynote speaker's presentation in the mornings, followed by a debate with an invited Brazilian professor. In the afternoon, we will have two conferences, each by a researcher, either from our research group or a long-time collaborator. This year's keynote speakers are the professors Gottfried Gabriel, University of Constance, Juliet Floyd, Boston University, Susan Krantz-Gabriel, St. Anselm College, Chiara Russo-Krauss, University of Naples, and Massimo Ferrari, University of Turin. The debaters will be respectively Marco Rufino, Unicampi, Mauro Engelmann, UFMG, Gabriel Ferreira, Unicinos, and Ernesto Giusti, Unicentro. Our afternoon talks will be delivered by Professor Boccaccini, UFAP, Professor Mauro Engelmann, UFMG, Professor Gabriel Ferreira, Unicinos, Professor Sheila Tomé, UFRGS, Professor Débora Moreira Guimarães, UERJ, Professor Ernesto Giusti, Unicentro, Dr. Brenda Soares, PUC São Paulo, and myself. Today's opening conference will be delivered by the esteemed Professor Gottfried Gabriel. He is well known for her work on logic and the history of analytic philosophy. Professor Gabriel's titles and achievements are too vast to be fully enumerated here. So I will sum it up by highlighting he is currently one of the most influential philosophers on her field. Professor Gabriel's lecture will be followed by a discussion with Marco Rufino, professor at the State University of Campinas. I would like to thank both of them for their participation in this meeting. Further, we are grateful for the support of both the São Paulo Research Foundation, FAPESP, and National Postgraduation Council, CAPS. It was only in virtue of them that it was possible to hold the meeting in this current format. Without further ado, I now invite Professor Gabriel to speak. Professor Gabriel.
Hello. Yeah, okay. I can start now, yeah? Many thanks for the kind introduction. Dear colleagues, friends, and students in Brazil. Firstly, I would like to thank you for inviting me to open the conference with my presentation. I would have loved to come to Brazil, but unfortunately, this was not possible for health reasons. Mario Porto and his colleagues and students have made it possible for me to present, at least virtually. Thank you very much for that. It It is a special pleasure for me that my former student, I would say my best student, and now colleague and friend Marco Rufino, has taken on the role of commentator. Unfortunately, the actual time here in Germany is not favorable for my lecture, because it's a time when an old man like me takes his afternoon sleep. Anyway, I hope that you won't notice this too much. I also sometimes have problems with verbal articulation. Please ignore this. And now I come to my presentation. Two things must be considered as background when comparing Lotz's and Frege's philosophy of language. Firstly, there is a classical position of Johann Gottfried Herder and Wilhelm von Humboldt, according to which there is a close connection between thought and language. For Herder and Humboldt, language and thought are two sides of the same coin. Secondly, there is a methodological aspect that Lotze and Frege developed their philosophy of language in close connection with logic. Before I go into my actual topic, I would like to begin with a brief characterization of Lotze's philosophical position, which may not be generally known. Lotze's leitmotif is his longing for unity, Sehnsucht nach Einheit, in the sense of a monistic worldview. This longing was conveyed to him through the reception of Spinoza in German idealism, especially in Schelling. Lotze's relationship to this tradition is ambivalent. Although he rejects its methods as scientifically useless, he explicitly acknowledged its goals. Lotze advocates a spiritualistic monism that regards the matter as secondary and dependent, as he says it. However, Lotze does not start from this monism. For him, it is rather the result of scientific research. In contrast to the authors of German idealism, he explains, quotation, the construction systems tend to begin with the same concept with which we end here, that of one Absolute. Das ist das Absolute des deutschen Idealismus, das Thema. The deductive derivation of reality from a supreme principle is replaced by an inductive approach, which was typical of the metaphysical efforts of scientific philosophers in the 19th century, like Gustav Theodor Fechner and Wilhelm Humboldt. Lotze already declared in his early logic from 1843 that it was important to precisely determine the value of language for logic and to work out, quotation, what logic lies hidden in language. In order to achieve this goal, Lotze uses language as a guide, emphasizing that, another quotation, the first trace of logical thought is to be found in the parts of speech, quotation end. The result is that language is closer to logic, he writes, than one is now usually inclined to believe. That is Lotze once more. Explication of logical structures of language can be found in the beginning of the logic of 1874, that is the late logic. However, as language not only serves thinking, but has other functions too. Lotze's philosophy of language is not restricted to logical analysis. Reflections on linguistic elements of a different kind can be found in the first paragraphs of the Logic of 1874 and the second volume of his Microcosmos. Frege adopted Lotze's method of logical analysis of language. Even though both philosophers start from linguistic observations, they do not follow them unquestioningly. as they are well aware that language can also be deceptive. In the early logic, this point is only hinted at, but it is elaborated in the later logic, in the 1874 version. In both versions, the central example is a tendency of language to suggest metaphysical hypostatizations. I will return to this very important point. The fact of Lotz's influence on Frege is of far-reaching significance. It is evident not only in the philosophy of language, but also in logic itself. Here we have important evidence that the common dichotomy, the separation between analytic and continental philosophy, is misguided. In order to determine more precisely what connects and separates the two traditions, it may be helpful to consider the historical context. For this reason, comparison with Johann Gottfried Herder and Wilhelm von Humboldt's views of language are significant. And Frege is influenced by them too, not only Lotze. For Herder, the figurative, poetic language is, as he says, the mother tongue, Muttersprache of the peoples. He argues that, quotation, poetry was older than prose. According to Herder, the further development of language was then subject to a process of aging, in the course of which there was a loss of vividness in favor of conceptual abstract thinking. Herder interprets this process almost as a decay. As a consequence, this means placing poetry above prose and science. However, Herder contradicts himself here, as he otherwise claims the reciprocal correspondence between reason and language, namely, quotation, the progress of language through reason and of reason through language. In this way, language becomes a, quotation, treasure trove of human thoughts, a treasure trove of human thoughts. In German, Schatzkammer menschlicher Gedanken. That was it for him. The treasure metaphor became a topos of the philosophy of language in the 19th century. Lotze states the formation of one's own thoughts has its starting point in the national treasure of traditional linguistic wisdom. That is a formulation from Lotze. Here, Lotze follows Humboldt's emphasis on the national character of individual languages. Frege's philosophical colleague in Jena, Otto Liebmann, takes a view related to Herder's when he writes that the treasure, quotation, the treasure of the vocabulary Wortschatz, he says in German, and the associated treasure of concepts, Begriffsschatz, the relation is important, the relation between Wortschatz and Begriffsschatz, are passed on from generation to generation through the transmission of the mother tongue, also die Muttersprache, mother tongue. Frege uses the term treasure of thoughts several times, emphasizing the objectivity of thought. Without this objectivity, as Frege writes, a common treasure of thoughts and a common science would be impossible. In the prominent passage in Über Sinn und Bedeutung, Frege insists that the sense of a sign, quotation, can be the common property, also das gemeinsame Eigentum, of many people. He then continues, quotation, for one can hardly deny that mankind has a common treasure of thought which is transmitted from one generation to another. By the way, that's amazing a little bit. Max Black translated the German word Schatz in his translation of Über Sinn und Bedeutung not as treasure, but as store, as a store. That means in German Vorrat, whereby the whole emphatic coloring is lost. Store is a stock of a merchant. It is not a treasure. You see, the emotive connotation is different. And it's very interesting that Black was a son of a merchant. So he took his experience as a son of a merchant into his translation, that he does not speak of treasure in an emphatic way, but simply of a store. I think it is a little bit amazing, this translation, because the emphatic coloring, as Frege would say, is lost. Schatz is more emphatic than store. Okay. I will come back on the question of coloring, Färbung, as Frege says. It's an important aspect. Unlike Herder and Liebmann, Frege does not link the treasure to the mother tongue. He emphasizes in Über Begriff und Gegenstand, quotation, for all the multiplicity of languages, mankind has a common treasure. So it is not a national treasure, but it is a treasure of the whole mankind. I think that's an interesting difference. Also, mankind has a common treasure of thoughts, he says. For Frege, language is a key to the treasure of thoughts. However, thoughts are not fundamentally bound to language. Insofar, Frege was not an ordinary language philosopher. He says, that is a quotation. The quotation is not on the handout. The quotations of the handout will come later in my presentation. Now, and a quotation from Frege, that is nachgelassene Schriften. Quotation: there is no contradiction in supposing there to exist beings that can grasp the same thought as we do without needing to clad it in a form that can be perceived by the senses. But still, for us, men, there is this necessity. So that means the connection between thought and language is therefore merely an anthropological fact. We as human beings cannot grasp thoughts without language. But so far it's a matter, it's an anthropological fact. This view corresponds to that of Lotze, who in his late logic, analyzes the activities of thought, he calls it Denkhandlung, on the basis of the forms of the parts of speech, but emphasizes that thoughts are not to be distinguished from their linguistic expressions and are not inseparably bound up with the existence of language. So it's the same idea. We have to go the way through language to the thought, but it's not necessary for all people, only for us as men. It's an anthropological connection. So insofar, Frege and Lotze have the same idea concerning thoughts. Lotze fundamentally insists that thought are, quotation, independent of its mode of expression, because, next quotation, the articulation and usage of language do not fully cover the work of thought, quotation end. For Lotze, every organization of thought has its genetic starting point in the national treasure of traditional linguistic wisdom, or the Sprachweisheit. Here we have in Lotze once more the national aspect, which is not in Frege. For Frege, it's a treasure of the mankind, not of the concrete nation. In the further course, however, it must be examined to what extent language not only enables thinking, but can also deceive it. Here, Lotze and Frege agree with each other. In Frege's well-known words, you know it from the Begriffsschrift, it is a task of philosophy to break the power of words over the human mind. Quotation end. So, philosophy of language becomes a critique of language with the help of logic. After the bitter experience of the failure of his program of logicism, Frege's criticism of language is intensified as a struggle against language. Quotation, a great part of the work of a philosopher consists, or at least ought to consist, in a struggle against language. While Herder places poetic language above conceptual language, Humboldt also appreciates conceptual language oriented towards truth. He advocates pursuing not only historical linguistics, but also systematic philosophy of language as a support for pure thought, especially in science. For the representation of pure thought, he already considers the possibility of transnational concept script, Begriffsschrift. So I think it's very interesting that the concept of Begriffsschrift, the term Begriffsschrift, also we have in Humboldt. It is not, we have it later, even in Humboldt already. The terminus Begriffsschrift, the Fregen terminus. It is not only Trendelenburg who uses expression. Before Trendelenburg, we find it already in Herder, in Humboldt. Yeah. Once more, for the representation of pure thought, he already considers the possibility of transnational concept script, a German Begriffsschrift, as a figurative script which designates logically defined concepts. However, he restricts this possibility to the extent that it could not capture the world in its vivid diversity, because that's the script neglects the emotive effects of the tone. So here we have the important difference between script and tone, which become important later in the discussion of deconstructivism. And the question is whether the tone is earlier than the script. Okay. So we have already in Frege the discussion between the difference between script and tone. Written language or language, articulated language. Okay. As I have already indicated, also Lotze believes that the function of language is not solely, he writes, solely to serve thought. Rather, it is also used to express, quotation, our poetically vivid and cozy view of the world, quotation end. So we have here an emotive aspect, a connotative aspect of language. However, Lotze rates the cognitive side of language higher than Humboldt, and above all higher than Herder. Lotze agrees with the latter that poetic devices such as analogies, similes, and metaphors belong to the use of the language. So that is a formulation of Herder too, and have increasingly disappeared in our developed language. So there is a way from poetic language to conceptual language that is okay, but that is not a problem for Lotze. So he accepts what Herder says, but he denies there is a problem here. That is, you don't speak of a decay of language here. Rather, Lotze considers it normal that language, in its growing objectivity, as he says, technical prose of life, eventually sheds its poetic and cozy side. So there's no problem. We come to concepts later, and that is not a decay of language as we have it in Herder's position. As far as thinking and its logic are concerned, Lotze emphasizes that, quotation, the mixing of etymological, syntactical, and linguistic coincidences with logic content should be avoided. Accordingly, Frege also endeavors in his concept script to disregard or even exclude all aspects of language that are not relevant to truth. These aspects include the grammatical differences between subject and predicate and between active and passive forms. Also, such forms of language would express nuances that are important for directing the listener's attention, for example. They would make no contribution to the thought itself and its structure. This also includes the use of interjections such as in German, ach, leider, Gottlob. The use of indexical expressions such as ich, hier, nun, in English, I, here, now, is also eliminated because it requires knowledge of the situation in which they are used in order to determine the complete thought. While Frege, and I think this is important, eliminates the aforementioned elements from logic on the one hand, he, like Lotze, recognizes their right and usefulness outside of logic on the other hand. In a very nice figurative comparison, Frege explains the relationship between the logical concept script and the everyday language of life. He speaks, I think it's a fine expression, Sprache des Lebens. I think it's a wonderful designation of natural language, Sprache des Lebens. With the help of the relationship he uses he uses the metaphor or the comparison between microscope and the eye. You know it from the Begriffsschrift. The concept script serves precision for certain scientific purposes. In this respect, the concept script is superior to everyday language, like the microscope to the eye. Conversely, everyday language, that is, Sprache des Lebens, like the eye compared to, the eye compared to the microscope proves it worse in practical life due to its better situational adaptability. So for the Sprache des Lebens, the language of life, is better for communication. So Frege separates scientific goals and everyday goals. And I think that is a very important aspect. So, for instance, Frege does not think like Wittgenstein in the Tractatus, that the logic is the deep structure of everyday language. Everyday language is completely different and has other functions. Okay. By addressing the language element, which are to be eliminated in logic, Frege simultaneously reveals a deep understanding of the achievements of language as a whole and develops ex negativo, so to speak, his philosophy of language, which has provided positive stimuli for the development of various theories. I think that's very important. These include pragmatics, in particular speech act theory and the theory of poetry, Dichtung, in the sense of fictional literature. So I think Frege, some remarks Frege present us, only remarks could use as a basis of complete new theories. For instance, look at his conception of judgment. He presents an idea of the pragmatic illocutionary force of language in case of the Behauptung. It's a statement. Frege uses die behauptende Rede. Here we have already the idea of illocutionary positions. Okay. The theory of speech acts, we can say, is a generalization of Frege's assertive force, behauptende Kraft. The theory of fictional literature can draw on Frege's semantic and pragmatic determinations of fictional discourse and on his remarks on the role of coloring, Färbung of thoughts. From a systematic point of view, there may be more to gain from Frege's writing than from Lotz's writings. However, the comparison shows that Frege largely agrees with Lotze in his view of the relationship between language and logic. On the one hand, the logical distinctions are worked out along the lines of linguistic syntactical differences, while on the other hand, their independence from linguistic expression is emphasized. There's also agreement that both know how to appreciate the non-logical aspects of language. So I think what Frege excludes, he already is only his remarks excluding some aspects of language and logic gives a basis to a foundation of new theories. I think that's very important. I think some notes or remarks Frege gives are sometimes more important than other books. So also only his remarks are very important for a systematic development of some ideas like speech act theory, poetry, and so on. In the case of poetry, I have ever done it myself to use Frege's aspects of poetry to establish a whole semantic and pragmatic theory of fictional discourse and literature. So anyway. Lotze and Frege's focus their analysis on the thought as a true or false content of a statement. Thoughts often remain linguistically underdetermined or overdetermined. Here Lotze, like Frege, later in Der Gedanke, distinguishes between the following two cases. On the one hand, knowledge of extra-linguistic circumstances such as the utterance situation may be required in order to supplement a content into a complete, namely true or false thought. This addition is then left to the guesswork of the listener. Bleibt, wie es heißt, dem Erraten des Zuhörers überlassen. Diese Formulierung, überlassen, dem Erraten des Zuhörers überlassen, is a formulation of Lotz's microcosmos. And literally the same formulation can also be found in Frege's Begriffsschrift. That these pragmatic aspects bleiben dem Erraten des Zuhörers überlassen. And it's very interesting that Frege uses the same formulation as Lotze here. Das Erraten des Zuhörers, dem Erraten des Zuhörers überlassen. On the other hand, language can enrich the thought of a statement from a communicative, rhetorical, or aesthetic point of view, without such elements being relevant for the content of the thought. The thought itself is understood as linguistically mediated propositional information. That is important. Frege is only interested in propositional formulations because they are true or false. Once more, the thought itself is understood as linguistically mediated propositional information that is not bound to language. Further reaching elements of communications such as interjections, tone of the voice, Tonfall der Stimme, and moods and wishes are attributed by Lotze to the cozy part, in German, gemütlichem Anteil of language. So that is a communicative side. We have in Lotze the same distinction between logic as a science and communication. So that is a difference between Begriffsschrift and Sprache des Lebens. It's the same separation of the both sides. And we have to realize that we need both sides, not only logic. Insofar, Lotze and Frege agree with one another about this separation between these two functions of language. And in this context, Lotze speaks of shading, Beleuchtung, and of coloring. That is the same distinction which Frege made in Übersinn und Bedeutung. Beleuchtung und Färbung. We have the same expressions here. Frege uses always the translation because he doesn't like foreign words. He tried always to use German words. And so he translates. Yeah, I think it's interesting. What is the origin of the colorit, the Färbung of language? And Dammet thinks about that, and he was astonished where Frege had, from which tradition Frege's use of the word Färbung could come. Because we have it in Lotze, but I think it's even older, because the origin of Färbung in Frege is the antique expression coloris rhetorici, also die rhetorischen Färbung. That is an expression used in the rhetoric. It's a rhetoric tradition to use expressions in the sense of coloris rhetorici, also die rhetorischen Färbung. And these Färbungen are used to present something or somebody in a more convincing way. These are emotional aspects of the language we use to characterize persons or things. And Frege uses Färbung exactly in the sense of the rhetoric tradition, of the tradition of coloris rhetorici. That is the origin. And it's interesting that this tradition is virulent in Lotze and in Frege. Okay. Lotze bases the formulation of the logical categories of thought on syntactic distinctions. Formulations such as independence, Selbstständigkeit, which the substantival form gives to its matter, most obviously by means of the article, and dependence, Unselbstständigkeit, expressed by the adjectival form. That is what Lotze says in paragraph 19 of the logic. And this distinctions are very similar to Frege's distinction between an independent name, which is complete, also abgeschlossen in itself, and a dependent predicate or conceptual expression in need of supplementation, Ergänzungsbedürftigkeit. Frege's remark in the Grundlagen that the numbers must be grasped not as dependent, unselbstständig attributes, but substantivish corresponds to Lotz's terminology. Frege later no longer uses the metaphysical terms substance and attribute to express Selbstständigkeit or Abgeschlossenheit of objects and Unselbstständigkeit oder Ergänzungsbedürftigkeit of concepts. In his microcosmos, Lotze speaks of independent and dependent thought atoms, requiring each other in order to form a complete thought. Frege adopts this view and develops it into his central categorical distinction between saturated and unsaturated linguistic expressions, gesättigt und ungesättigt. That is a central distinction in Frege. And it is used for the sense and even for the meaning. Differences between Lotze and Frege seem to arise from the fact that Lotze defends the traditional division of the logical Elementallehre into the doctrine of concept, the doctrine of judgment, and the doctrine of conclusion, as can still be found in Kant's logic. That is the Elementallehre in Kant's logic. This is surprising in view of his own logical interpretation of Plato's theory of ideas, to which I will come back later, and the criticism expressed in his context of the tendency, quotation, to bring into the inadequate form of a single concept truth which can only be adequately expressed through the proposition. So, in this sense, the center in Lotze's logic is a proposition and not the concept. So insofar, the question is why he uses the old distinction of Begriff, Urteil, and Schluss, and concept is primary for him. That is, we have formulations which accept that the judgment is the primary entity. When Lotze states that logic begins with a conviction that that is a formulation by Lotze, that there is a difference between truth and falsehood, that is a starting point of logic. The primacy of judgment over the concept is already expressed. Frege followed this up verbatim in Kernsatz 12, where he says, quotation, logic only begins with a conviction that there is a difference between truth and falsehood. That is exactly the formulation of Lotze. According to Frege, concepts are obtained by decomposing, zerfällen, heißt es bei Frege, judgeable contents. But he also admits, however, in order to be able to decompose in this way, the expression of the judgeable content must already be structured in itself. So the conceptual structure is in the propositional already. It concerns to the deep structure of the proposition. Insofar, to say that the proposition or the judgment is primary includes that we have the conceptual order already in the deep structure of the proposition. Insofar, he thus corresponds to Lotze's view that the formation of a thought requires a prior logical formation of its components. That means what I said before. Frege's famous distinction between the sense and meaning of linguistic expressions is also outlined by Lotze. Both are concerned with the problem of how statements of identity, especially statements of identity in arithmetic, can be guaranteed a cognitive value. Lotze's result is that such statements are in content identical, yet in form synthetic. That is the formulation in Lotze. In content identical, yet in form synthetic. The expression, for instance, 7 plus 5 and 6 plus 6, for example, denotes the same numerical value, but through their linguistic forms indicate its quotation various ways, various unterschiedliche Wege, various ways by which we may arrive at one and the same quantitative value. Excuse me. Important is here the metaphor of the way, different ways to the same, which is used by Lotze and by Frege. Also, various ways by which we may arrive at one and the same quantitative value. It is easy to recognize Frege's solution here that two expressions that have the same meaning can nevertheless have different senses, in that they characterize a different mode of presentation, Art des Gegebenseins, of the same object as a meaning. That is the solution über Sinn und Bedeutung. The value of identities is that we have different presentations, mode of presentations of the same. The mode of presentations is the Sinn, and die Bedeutung is the reference of the Unterschied, the different expressions. Once more, it is easy to recognize Frege's solution here that two expressions that have the same meaning can nevertheless have different senses, in that they characterize a different mode of presentation of the same object as the meaning. The origin of Frege's distinction between sense and meaning becomes even clearer if one compares his Sinn und Bedeutung with Funktion und Begriff, which appeared 1 year earlier. Here, that means in Funktion und Begriff, Frege refers terminologically to Lotze's distinction between form and content when he states that, quotation, a mere expression, no, the form of a content, he says, the form of the content, that is Lotze's terminology. A mere expression, the form of a content cannot be the essence of the matter. Funktion und Begriff, he says it. The essence is rather that, quotation, the different expressions correspondent to different conceptions and sides of the same thing. With this formulation, Frege places his distinction between sense and meaning in the Leibniz tradition of epistemological perspectivism, continued by Lotze, namely the possibility of being able to adopt different perspectives or ways on the same thing. And it's interesting that Frege's metaphor of different ways to the same, the different ways are the senses. This metaphor of different ways is found in Lotze's, the same metaphor. We have already seen that Lotze uses the metaphor of the path to illustrate this perspectivism. The same metaphor can be found in Frege's criticism of Biermann's concept of number. Yes, now we can use my handout. It's a first quotation in the handout. Different signs for the same thing are unavoidable because one can be led to it in different ways, and then it must first. I have some problems. Because one can be led to it in different ways. Here we have the metaphor. And then it must first be established that one has really achieved the same thing. In an explanatory note, he says, that is quotation 2, here we see the number do not come into being, they are eternal. There is not one, for that would be have arisen from, yes, now different forms of the four. And these different forms you can see in the quotation are only different signs for the same thing, whose difference only indicates the different ways. Here again we have the metaphor of different ways in which the same thing can be achieved. By the way, the eternity of numbers does not mean an infinite duration in time, but extratemporality in the sense that for categorical reasons, temporal predicates are out of place for numbers. That is important, I think. Does not mean that the Ewigkeit does not mean that they exist in time, but it is meant that time predicates are for categorical reasons out of place. The comparison with Lotze confirms the thesis of the epistemological origin of the distinction between sense and meaning. It also makes it clear that Frege's terminology is more appropriate than has usually been recognized. The German word Sinn means the way, the direction of the cognition of a thing. We have it still in German in the word Uhrzeigersinn. In Portuguese, that's interesting. The connection between Weg, Richtung und Sinn is very well understood because sentido means both sense and direction. When I came to Brazil and could read the sign todos os sentidos, alle Richtungen, I thought in Brazil you can understand Frege better than in Germany. Anyway, todos os sentidos. That is, I think, very fine to explain what Frege means with Sinn. The understanding that the sense consists in determining the meaning of an expression is thus nothing more than a semantic reformulation of the original epistemological idea that the path determines the goal, namely the object of knowledge, and that different paths, namely different senses, can lead to the same goal, namely the same meaning, the same object as meaning. And it's very interesting that we have the same metaphor in Lotze. In the last part of my lecture, I will return to Lotze's warning against metaphysical hypostatizations that are suggested to us through language. I think that's a very important part. In this context, it is important to note that sentences that are completely correctly formed according to the grammar and syntax of normal language can nevertheless contain nonsensical content. That is what Lotze explicitly says. So, from the perspective of German grammatical ideas, these sentences are completely in order. but there is a tendency to misunderstand it in the philosophical way. Okay, that's a semantic, nevertheless, is nonsensical. That is an idea we find later in Wittgenstein and Carnap. We have German sentences which are concerning the grammatical structure completely in order, but from a logical or philosophical point of view, they are nonsensical. That is, I think, a very important point found in Lotze, which characterizes the idea of logical analysis of language. Okay. Caution is particularly advised when using the definite article. I think that's a very interesting point in Lotze. The article in the singular. We have here quotation number 3 in the handout. The logical objectivation, then, which the creation of a name, that is with help of the definite article in the singular, implies, does not give an external reality to the matter named. The common word in which others are expected to recognize what we point to is, speaking generally, only the world of thought. So we have to distinguish with the world of thought and the world of things. The world of thought is that what Frege later called what was it? The Dritte Reich, the third realm. And here we have the thoughts are placed in a special world, the world which is in Frege later der Gedanke, das Dritte Reich. Here we have the same idea. Okay. Once more, the common world in which others are expected to recognize what we point to is, speaking generally, only the world of thought, not the world of reality, neither psychological nor physical reality. It is exactly Frege's third world. Anyway, what we do here is to ascribe to it the first trace of that's dangerous, of an existence of its own and an inward order which is the same for all thinking beings and independent of them. This translation in the German original, we don't have existence, we have bestehen. That is, it is exactly the idea that Lotze concerning the third reality of the third world is not an existing one. So for Lotze, it is important that what is valid, das Gelten, is not existence. We'll come back later to this. So the word of the word of the contents of the thought is not an existing word. This word does not exist. That is, let me say, the content does not exist. The content is valid. So for Lotze, it's important to make this difference between existence and validity. And for this reason, the translation of bestehen in the original of Lotze's logic, the translation of bestehen by the word existence is not correct. It is just the opposite in Frege, in Lotze. He does not accept that bestehen is already existence. Bestehen is Geltung, validity. Okay. So we have to take into account that this is a false translation. Anyway, how important the warning against hypostasis was to Lotze, it can be seen from the fact that he repeats it in the rather popular Microcosmos. That is quotation 4. Language creates a mythology for us, which we can never completely avoid in the use of speech without becoming pedantic out of precision, but whose influence on the shaping of our thoughts we must carefully prevent. Logic does not always do its part to this end, but sometimes makes harmful concessions in its instructions to this false tendency in the use of language. That is a danger of language, that we use the language to imply philosophical consequences. And here, Lotze's warning is especially concerning the use of the definite article in singular. And this is important for Frege and his logical program of logicism. Frege could have read in Lotze the warning that, quotation, nothing is more disastrous, that is Lotze, than the objectifying use of the definite article in the singular, which arises from the tendency to, Lotze says, reinterpret the new syntactic dignity of words into a new metaphysical dignity of their content. Excuse me, my telephone. Okay. Once more. Frege could have read in Lotze the warning that nothing is more disastrous than the objectifying use of the definite article in the singular, which arises from the tendency to reinterpret the new syntactic dignity of words into a new metaphysical dignity of their content. That is a quotation from Lotze. Frege has fallen into precisely this trap by recognizing it as a criterion. You know the famous quotation from Grundlagen der Arithmetik, paragraph 51. Quotation, that the singular definite article always indicates an object. That is exactly the trap in which Frege falls. And Lotze, he could have read it by Lotze, but in this case he didn't follow Lotze. Accordingly, he takes number expressions such as the 0, the 1, and so on, as an opportunity to characterize numbers as objects. Since numbers are not sensory objects, they must be logical objects, which Frege then introduces as specific extensions of concepts. That is exactly Lotze warns us to use the definite article in the singular as a kind of objectifying, and exactly Frege uses in this way, and this is a trap for him. Okay, what is the result? Ja, das ist ein bisschen schwierig mit meinen Fingern. Okay. As is well known, the unlimited transformation of concepts into extensions of concepts led to Russell's antinomy. As a result, Frege abandoned his program of logicism to prove arithmetic as a purely logical science. How painful this resigned step was for Frege can be seen from certain emphatic colorings in Frege's presentation of this program. Frege was aware that by introducing logical objects, which also include truth values, he was contradicting the fundamental position of Kant, of the position, namely that every object of human knowledge is so Kant, what Kant says, is a product of the intellect from materials of sensuality. That is a connection, every object is a connection of Begriff and Anschauung, concept and intuition. That is central for Kant. And Frege contradicts exactly this Kantian position when he writes, that is quotation 5, I must also contradict the generality of Kant's claim that without sensibility, no object would be given to us. The 0 and the 1 are objects that cannot be given to us through the senses. That is a point which people not always realize, because this implies Frege's characterization of numbers as objects cannot be given to us sensually corresponds to Kant's definition of intelligible objects. That is quotation 6. Objects are called intelligible, this is a quotation from Kant, Prolegomena. Objects are called intelligible as far as they can only be imagined by the intellect and cannot approach by any of our sensory perceptions. And it is clear Kant denies that intelligible objects exist. That is central for Kant. And exactly this position is discussed by Frege, and Frege does not follow and says we have intellectual objects. So insofar, here we have a metaphysical position in Kant, in Frege, a metaphysical position which Kant denies. That's, I think, very interesting, this connection. While Kant rejects intelligible objects altogether, Frege celebrates numbers as objects of reason, and this status explains for him the attraction that work on arithmetic and analysis holds. I think that Frege has here a metaphysical interest. He speaks of the attraction. Also, the attraction means, in German it is a Reiz. The Reiz of arithmetic consists in presenting intellectual objects. And of course, this is a metaphysical Reiz. And Reiz is an interesting use of the expression Reiz. That my interest in arithmetic is exactly because arithmetic represents intellectual objects. And it is clear that Frege goes in metaphysics here against Kant. For Kant, that is bad metaphysics to accept logical objects. And we should posit this idea in the metaphysical tradition. Once more, while Kant rejects intelligible objects altogether, Frege celebrates, by using the word Reiz, celebrates numbers as objects of reason, and this status explains for him the attraction, the Reiz, that work on arithmetic and analysis holds. Quotation 7, adopting the familiar words, it might well be said that the real object of reason is reason itself. We are concerned in arithmetic not with objects that become known to us through the medium of the senses as something foreign from outside, but with objects that are immediately given to reason, which can fully comprehend them as its own. And yet, or rather precisely because of this, these objects are not subjective fantasies. There is nothing more objective than arithmetical laws. Quotation end. Here, arithmetical knowledge is elevated to a sublime form of self-knowledge of reason. In this respect, the attraction or the Reiz referred to will be more than a mere intellectual pleasure. It is more like to consist in the satisfaction of a metaphysical need. In arithmetic, reason deals, so to speak, in an emphatic sense, only with itself, with its own logical laws and logical objects. In the year of Kant's 300th birthday, we can state that Kant was right when he denied the possibility of objects of reason. It sounds like a repetition of Lotz's warning when Frege explains at the end, quotation 8, one characteristic of language that is fatal to the reliability of thought is its tendency to create proper names to which no object corresponds. And that was exactly what Frege did. So it's an accusation of his own ideas. Accordingly, Frege makes the demand a warning sign. You see, now we have another emphatic position, just the other way around, the contrast. A warning sign must be erected that is visible from afar. No one should think of turning, German word verwandeln, a concept into an object. So this dramatic formulation is exactly because Frege was so disappointed that it was not the case. So he realized that he didn't follow his teacher Lotze in this way, and exactly that was a problem for his complete program of logicism. A warning sign must be erected that is visible from afar. No one should think of turning a concept into an object. So follow Lotze. Frege's self-criticism presents us with a problem that arises precisely because he rejects his original view that word formations of the form the concept F denote objects. This step leaves open what status such expressions like the concept F have instead. That is a problem of word and of Begriff und Gegenstand. The paper of Begriff und Gegenstand. Where Frege says that the concept F is because of the definite article the here. The concept F is not an F, is not a function, but an object. How would the late Frege treat this idea, this problematic idea? The concept, the expression, the concept F is not a concept but an object because of the definite article in singular. How can we handle this problem? But this is not my part today. I cannot go into this difficult question here. This treatment would lead too far away from Lotze. I would therefore return to Lotze and discuss his interpretation of Plato's theory of ideas. From Lotze's point of view, it is wrongly assumed that Plato had hypostasized ideas into real existing things. Do you see that's the same problem you already had? That Bestand is not existence. Geltung is not existence. And he tries to interpret Plato not as a Platonist, in this way that Plato, in his theory of ideas, did not understand the ideas, the Platonic ideas, as existing objects. I think that's an important step, perhaps an interesting one. I will follow this line in a short way to come to the end. Okay. Also Lotz's interpretation of Plato's theory of ideas. From Lotz's point of view, it is wrongly assumed that Plato had hypostasized idea into real existing things. The usual interpretation that Plato was a realist in the sense of the classical universal dispute is rejected by Lotze. In short, for Lotze, Plato is not a Platonist. That is the point. Plato is not a Platonist in this realistic sense of the classical universal dispute of the Middle Ages. This again suggests a comparison between Lotze and Frege. The question is whether a corresponding interpretation of the position of Frege, who is generally regarded as a Platonist, is possible. I would like such interpretation, that is, to interpret Frege in the same way as Lotze interprets Plato. The question is, in which sense is Frege a Platonist or not a Platonist? I think that insofar the idea of Lotze is an interesting point and perhaps can be used to interpret Frege as well. Anyway, Lotze presents his reconstruction of Plato's theory of ideas by introducing the concept of validity. Here comes the concept of validity comes here in. This is a very important concept. Validity is a concept formulated by Lotze. Geltung in German, which should not be confused with the concept of being existence. So the idea of Lotze's reconstruction of Plato's idea is to make a difference between Geltung and existence, between validity and being. In German, Geltung and Existenz are to distinguish. The correct interpretation for Lotze is that quotation that Plato never asserted the existence of the ideas, but only their internal validity. Here we have exactly the opposition between existence and validity. You can find it in his later Logic of 1874 in paragraph 318. That's a very important paragraph, 318. On the question of the localization of ideas, Lotze states accordingly. So they don't exist in a platonic heaven. That is often Plato is interpreted in this way, that there is a special heaven in which the ideas exist. And on the question of localization, see the last quotation, number 10. That is a famous formulation. When Plato relegates the ideas to a home which is not in space, he is not trying to hypostasize that which we call their mere validity into any kind of real existence. But on the contrary, he is plainly seeking to guard altogether against any such attempts being made. That is the same idea that Frege used, that formulations insofar of a home location, that such formulations are out of categorical reasons out of place. So Plato contradicts the idea to give the ideas a special reality. They don't exist, but they are valid. So Following Frege, this can interpret it in such a way that spatial predicates cannot be applied to ideas for categorical reasons. They are out of place. What Lotze obtained by his interpretation was a reunion of Platonic and Kantian philosophy in an epistemological position which was called transcendental Platonism, not ontological Platonism, that is a difference, but transcendental Platonism. This position is Platonistic, this combination between Plato and Kant. This position of transcendental Platonism is Platonistic because it accepts contents of thinking which are independent of the individually thinking subjects, and it is transcendental as opposed to transcendent because the independence is not an ontological one of being in existence, but a logical one of being valid. To put this idea into the form of a transcendental argument, we may give the following explanation. Logic starts with making a distinction of value between truth and untruth. That is in logic of the paragraph Roman number 2 in the Roman number words, paragraph 2. True and untrue or false cannot appear as properties of processes of thinking, but only of contents of thinking. To talk about truth and falsehood necessarily presupposes, as a conditio sine qua non, as a condition of possibility in the Kantian sense, that we first have grasped the same cognitive content and are discussing the same thought. To take this consequence seriously, we have to accept that a thought cannot be a psychological item, because such a view would imply that different individual subjects are not able to participate at the same cognitive content of thought. The independence of thoughts means nothing more than stating the following categorical fact. An item which we want to value as true or false, that is, an item which is meant as a bearer of a truth value, cannot have individual psychological existence. On the other hand, this does not imply that we have to look after any kind of existence different from psychological existence. Such an attempt is out of place, and insisting on such an attempt is a categorical mistake. Cognitive content does not exist, it is valid or invalid. To be valid does not imply to be. To give a short and handy characterization of this position, we might explain it by converting the well-known slogan, "No entity without identity," into the slogan, just the other way around, "But identity without entity." We need the identity because to discuss questions of truth or untruth, we have to accept that there is a common content we grasp, and that can't be a psychological entity. So that is the idea of the formulation. But identity, we need identity, otherwise we couldn't discuss questions of truth. We need identity, but without identity, we have validity, but not existence. It is a transcendental condition of talking about truth and falsity that the bearer of a truth value remains identical, but is not necessary to accept this bearer as an ontological entity. Lotze's conception of the validity of ideas presupposes the eternal self-identical significance of ideas, but it does not include the being of or existence of these ideas and the conceptual content. It should be clear I come to the end now. It should be clear that Lotze here prepared the categorical basis for the separation of logical investigations from psychological ones. The self-identical meaning content of propositions later appeared, for instance, as in the philosophical tradition. It is considered always the same. We have different expressions. That is, we have, for instance, Gedanke in Frege, Sinngebilde in Rickert, Objektiv in Meinung, and Ideal identischer Inhalt by Husserl. It should be mentioned that these concepts have their forerunner in Bolzano's Satz an sich. And the question is always whether we can understand what these expressions mean without accepting that these exist. I think in Bolzano, I think there is a view that they, in one sense, exist. But the question is whether we need this implication that these exist, or is it enough to say that they are valid or invalid? So the idea of a transcendental Platonism is the idea to accept contents without accepting that they exist. They only are valid. Concerning Lotze himself, we have to add that he was not completely clear about the fact that the content has to be accepted as the same, even if it is not valid. It is not completely clear, but in Lotze. The self-identity of the content does not depend on its validity. A content which is not valid has to be the same too. Otherwise, we could not apply the predicate invalidity to it. So we have not only accept non-psychological contents which are valid, but also contents which are not valid. That is the same question whether invalid contents we accept. We can compare it with a later discussion whether there are negative facts or not. We have this problem, for instance, in Russell. Should we accept that there are negative facts or only positive facts? So that is very similar to this later discussion. Have we to accept negative contents and not only positive contents? And it is clear from Frege that we have to accept negative contents. Otherwise, we couldn't declare that they are invalid. Okay. The transcendental condition of self-identity does hold not only for valid, but for not invalid contents too, for not only for valid, but for not valid contents too. This point was made clear in the further development of logical value theory, especially by Frege in his article Die Verneinung. Well, the inclusion of Frege in the discussion of Lotze's philosophy of language should make it clear, by way of example, that it is wrong to contrast analytic and continental philosophy. In Lotze and Frege, we have a strong connection between both. Once more, as we have seen, Lotze, as a representative of continental philosophy, anticipated essential results of the analytic philosopher Frege. And there are even insights by Lotze that Frege should have taken into account. Okay, Thank you.
Thank you so very much, Professor Gabriel. And now we're going to give the floor to Professor Marco Fino for his comments. Marco, welcome and thank you so very much for your presence with us.
Thank you. Can you hear me well?
Yeah.
Yes, it's perfect.
Okay. Well, first of all, I would like to thank a lot Mario Porta and Ricardo Melani to invite me to join you in this conference. It's remarkable that it's the 15th edition of the conference. So you really established a new tradition in Brazilian philosophy. So congratulations on the 5th edition, right? And it's for me a special joy to comment and to see my old master, Professor Gottfried Gabriel, right? We have a personal story, personal history together. He came to the Unicamp in the 80s, late 80s from last century. He was a visiting professor here. And during his stay here, he was editing Lotz's Logik, yeah? And he used to tell us about how important Lotze was and so on. And later I came to Constance to study, to write my master's dissertation under his supervision. It was a great year, thanks especially to his encouragement, his generosity, and his kindness. Yeah, he's not what we usually expect from a German professor. He's a very friendly, very open person, very informal as well. And there are other Brazilian students there, other people that he was advising as well, and they are nowadays professional philosophers. So he gave us all the zin in philosophy, o sentido da filosofia. Yeah, and I'm very thankful for that. And thanks to his encouragement as well, I published my first paper in philosophy, which was in Frege. Very much, I mean, it was very much due to his encouragement and his comments on my paper. Later, I went to after my master's, which I wrote under his supervision, I went to the United States for my PhD and part of my career. But I always kept this image of philosophy as something really fascinating, especially that he transmitted to me, especially this capacity for comparing different philosophers on similar theses, right? So to use another Fregean term, he gave me this Verbung of philosophy, which is something that I really very much cherish nowadays. Later, when I was finishing my PhD, he was already full professor in Jena, holding the chair, the chair in logic and metaphysics, logic and philosophy of language, or logic and epistemology. I don't remember exactly how it was called. And I had the honor.
Logik und Wissenschaftstheorie.
Logic and philosophy of science.
Yeah.
And I had the honor to be his wissenschaftliche Mitarbeiter, yeah, to be his junior assistant for a year and a half. And the interesting thing is that Professor Gottfried Gabriel made a point of living exactly in front of Frege's house. Right? He was very proud, showing to all his visitors Frege's house, talking about the details of Frege's house. So I have a very, very happy experience with Professor Gabriel. So that's, for me, it's a great, great pleasure to be here with him today, even at a distance. I owe a lot to him, and I'm very grateful for his encouragement, for his friendship, and everything. He was kind enough to send me his paper in advance. So I'm going to ask some few questions about his ideas. First, I will start with some minor details about Herder and Lotze regarding the relation, the evolution of language, right? And then I'll pass to some more specific questions about the application of Lotze's ideas in the logische Untersuchungen, Frege's logical investigations, right? Some things that we are very interested. I'm very interested here with my students. So I want to hear him more talking about negation and Verbung and things that Frege mentions in the logical investigations. And I will finish my questions with two very, very general questions. One about Lotze, why Lotze being both an analytic and continental philosopher, according to his characterization, and another one about Kant. Yeah. So I'll follow a sequence here that we agreed upon. My first question, Gottfried, is about your comment on page 2 about Herder. Herder saying that figurative poetic language is the mother tongue, right? Herder saying that poetry was older than prose.
Yeah.
And I want to ask you whether he mentions whether he means that seriously or also in a sort of poetic or metaphorical way, because the evidence that we have from science is the opposite, right? So the human language evolved from so to say human needs in searching for food or escaping danger and warnings and so on, and only later, much later, it evolved to sort of poetic or artistic forms. So does Herder really mean that, or should we take that as a more like in a metaphorical way, or so to say, what is more important for him, right?
Well, I think that Herder does not assumes that poetic language is absolutely the very first, but rather that, relatively speaking, languages are originally more poetic in semantics, namely in the use of figurative expressions and metaphors. This does not include the possibility, or let me say, that does not exclude the possibility that in pragmatic perspective, that is your perspective, that warnings and things like that and assertions, warnings and other speech acts are primary. So it's more concerning the semantic of language. So that would mean that even the assertions or warnings are formulated in a language which is more colored, in a language with more Färbungen. Yeah, so that the use in the pragmatic sense, that of course it may be that assertions are primary, and we first use language to warn our neighbors and so on. But that is a pragmatic role. But the question is in which semantic you use your warnings. And I think Herder would say that the semantic of the warnings which is prior to poetry. So we have to distinguish between poetry and poetic language. That is, poetic language is gefärbte Sprache. That is language with coloring. And even the warnings may be colored. So in the semantic sense, it is indeed that the figurative, metaphorical, and in so far poetic or rhetorical language is earlier than conceptual scientific language. But it is not so Herder would not refer to the pragmatic aspects of language, and so far you are right that warnings are prior to poetic, yeah. But the poetic side of language is more on the semantic, not on the pragmatic side. I would give this answer to your question, which is obviously correct to remember or to argue that warnings are earlier than poetry, fiction, or things like that. So we have to distinguish the semantic and the pragmatic side. And concerning the semantic side, I think that Herder might be right. You can find, for instance, you have children too. So for me, it was very interesting that my daughters use metaphorical expressions before using concepts. So there might be, so if there is a connection here, we can say that in children, metaphorical language is earlier than conceptual use of language. And this may be the same in the development of the mankind, that these metaphors are earlier than the conceptual language. So that would be to try to give some, to accept Herder, at least in this sense.
Okay, good. There's also a phrase of yours on page 3. You are talking about Lotze and the way Lotze sees the relation between language, critique of language and logic. And you formulate in the following way: philosophy of language becomes a critique of language with the help of logic. My question was about what comes first. It seems to me that, at least in Frege's version of it, I mean, logic is obtained through critique of language. Let's say that's expelling from language what is inessential to reasoning. So logic does not come in as a help or as an auxiliary to the critique of language, but is the product of the critique of language. That's at least how I would see the things in Frege. Would you agree with that, or in Lotze is it different? I mean, you first have logic, and logic as a tool for criticizing language.
I think we have both. I wouldn't separate both sides. In my opinion, critique of language clarifies logical relationship. That's okay. For example, the logical insight that existence is a second-level concept is a result of critique of language. When Frege analyzes the concept of existence, it is a result of critique of language to understand that existence is not that existence is a second-level concept. Conversely, this insight can be used to criticize language. If you have the insight that existence is a concept of second order, because this result allows you to criticize, for instance, and Frege mentioned it himself, the ontological argument of the existence of God. So you can use this logical insight to criticize the special language. Or, for instance, or maybe a better example, Carnap's critique of Heidegger. Carnap uses logic to criticize Heidegger. So insofar, I think the connection between critique of language and logic, we have a strong connection, and we don't have to separate both sides. I think both is the end. We have the result of critique of language, that logic comes out. Frege does it indeed, but it goes the other way around too, that we use logical distinctions to say, as Carnap says, that Heidegger, when he speaks of das Nichts nichtet, that here we didn't understand how the concept of existence is to use. So here we have a logical distinction which help us to criticize the language of metaphysical authors, for instance. So at least that is Carnap's goal. So Carnap uses logic to criticize. So we have the other way around too. So I think we have a connection between both goals. It's not only the only way to do critique of language to come to logical distinctions. We have the other way around too. Okay. Right. That is my position.
Okay. Yeah, I was thinking more on some passages in which Frege says, well, we must expel from language what is inessential for logic in order to obtain purity, so to say, a purely logical reasoning. So I was looking from the other perspective, but you are Okay, I think both things are right as well. Yeah.
Also in Frege, I think it's clear that he uses analysis of language to come to pure logic. That is one direction. But we have in the history of philosophy the other way, the other direction too, that logic is used to criticize special philosophy, the language, for instance, of Heidegger. Carnap uses the logic to criticize Heidegger as something which is nonsense. You must not be right. The question is whether Carnap is right here, but in fact, he tries to use logic to criticize special metaphysics.
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay, great. The third minor question is related to the first one. Again, about the priority of metaphorical or poetical discourse versus science, or you make a remark on page 4. You say Lotze agrees with the latter that poetic devices such as analogies, similes, and metaphors belong to the youth of language and have increasingly disappeared in our developed language. What is interesting here is that Austin has a comment in How to Do Things with Words that goes exactly in the opposite direction. Austin says, no, we first have proper assertions, and then poetry or fiction comes as a sort of parasitic use of assertions or serious assertions, right? So the Austin sees it in the opposite way. Yeah, we first have serious discourse, and then poetry comes as a sort of relaxing or easing some ties of our serious discourse with reality. It's just a remark. I mean, it's related to the first question, and maybe you answer
would answer it in the same way. But in fact, I don't like Austin's word parasitic, because it implies that poetry is parasitic, and I think poetry is another kind of cognition. So I always defended the cognitive value of poetry against some people, and I think the word parasitic is dangerous, and I think that was a reason why some deconstructivistic philosophers argued against Austin. It's a dangerous word, but in general, I would say would answer your question in the same way as the other one. That we have to look at the difference between assertions and fictions in a pragmatic way. It is all once more a pragmatic question. The assertions may be earlier. What is meant is that figurative speech is earlier than conceptual speech. So once again, in the pragmatic way, the assertions might be prior to poetry, yeah. But concerning the poetic language, the connotations, the Färbung, the semantic sides, the fab, even the pragmatic parts may be concerned the semantic side. There might be poetry, or Färbung might be earlier than conceptual, to a conceptual way. Well, to refer to Nietzsche, for instance, when Nietzsche says concepts are dead metaphors, that is a famous problematic position of Nietzsche in Über Wahrheit und Lüge im außermoralischen Sinn. He says, and it's not completely wrong, that our concepts are dead metaphors, so that the metaphors are prior. And that is, again, the semantic side. Concerning the pragmatics, I think Austin is right, but that is this has only to do with the pragmatic side and not with the semantic side. And the Färbung might be earlier than the concept. So in fact, it's the same answer I give it to this point, the same answer as I gave you to the question how Lotze, how Herder understood this relationship between semantics and pragmatics. Okay, it's a similar answer from a semantic point of view. We could argue against Austin, but concerning the let's say the pragmatic illocutionary side, the illocutionary side, that is different. Once more, warnings and assertions might be earlier than poetry, but the poetic language, that is Färbung, are earlier than the concepts. So we have to distinguish once more between the pragmatic and the semantic side. So, okay.
So now I move to some questions, Gottfried, specifically about logical investigations, because I'm dealing with this text with my students, and we have some doubts. So I'm going to ask you, maybe they are not directly related to your talk, but you can give us some illumination here. First, you mentioned that the text Die Verneinung, the negation, where Frege is talking about the value of false thoughts. So one of the things that Frege is arguing against two main theses in Die Verneinung, the negation. First, that only true thoughts exist. I mean, he takes time to argue that also false thoughts also exist, and they are also very important for us. At least as important as true thoughts. And second, he's arguing against the idea that the negation of a thought destroys the thought, right? So here are my questions. Whether he has a Lotzian inspiration on those two, opposition to these two theses, and second, and more importantly, who would have think this way? Who would have think that only true thoughts exist? And that negation destroys a thought. Maybe Frege is probably having an opponent here in mind, but who would be that opponent?
It is Bruno Bau.
Who? Bruno Bau.
Bruno Bau, yeah.
Bruno Bau.
It's completely clear. You can read it in the book I published with Sven Schlotter, our Frege book, with the title Frege und die kontinentalen Ursprünge der analytischen Philosophie. Also Frege and the continental origins of analytic philosophy. And you can read it on, I think I gave the book to you some years ago. You can read it. There's a page 210 and 213, up to between 210 and 230. And Sven Schlotter has shown in a special article published in History and Philosophy of Logic. I have this here. That is History and Philosophy of Logic, volume 27, that page 43 to 58. He has analyzed the arguments, and it's completely Bruno Bau. And that once more is, I think, very interesting that Frege often refers to positions which he doesn't identify by names. It's very interesting. And I think that was a reason why people thought that Frege started a new philosophy without realizing that he received things like Lotze, but not only Lotze, that is Trendelenburg, that is Siegwart, that is Herbart, and many others, although the Neo-Kantian, for instance, Windelband. And so it's because Frege didn't mention the authors he had read by name, people like Dammit thought that Frege was an absolute beginner. In fact, he was influenced. He was part of the German philosophical tradition, and that the English-speaking people didn't realize it because they didn't know these old German textbooks. Yeah, and insofar, this example you asked me, and now who was it? Because he is anonymous. He is an anonymous author, and it is completely clear what Sven Schlotter demonstrated by textual evidence that Frege was referring to Bruno Bauch, and we know that Bruno Bauch asked Frege to comment an article by him, and you find Frege's argument against this position that by negation contents are destroyed. All these false ideas. Frege criticizes this position, but does not say who it is, right, whom he criticized. And Sven Schlotter, you know him, demonstrated, I think, completely clear and convincing that it is Bruno Bauch. And they were in contact. Okay.
Okay, that's great to know. Thanks a lot.
Yeah.
Let me move to my second question, and is a question for you and also for Mario Porta, because I know he has written a very nice paper about this. But it's your talk, so I'm going to ask you. When next time I will ask Mario Porta again. The thing is about the use of the word decision, Entschlüsse, in the essay Der Gedanke, in the thought. Yeah. I mean, Frege talks about idea, Vorstellungen, as including emotions, representations, perceptions, and so. But he leaves out Entschlüsse, he leaves out decisions, yeah, right? Well, so here's the question: why do you think he does this? And is there any Lotzian roots in his exclusion of decisions from the realm of ideas? Yeah?
Well, I didn't find something in Lotze, but we should later ask Mario whether he had found some points. The reason, my position is, the reason why Frege did not include Entschlüsse in Vorstellung, I think that Frege does not count decisions as ideas or Vorstellung because there are decisions that are not just made privately, but collectively. For instance, in the parliament, if a parliament entschließt what to do, that is a decision which is not a private decision, but a collective decision. And of course, that is not private, not only subjectively, but it is realized in reality. We decide, wir haben uns entschlossen, this Gesetz, this law to accept. That is an Entschluss of a parliament, and that is not subjective. That is one reason. And moreover, judgments, that is important, are also Entschlüsse. For the recognition of truth through a judgment is an Entschluss. That is, Frege accepts the old idea that judgments are acts of the will. That is a Descartes idea, that judgments are concerned, to make a judgment is an act of the will. I accept a content as true. So Urteile, judgments are Entschlüsse too, and of course, they are made by subjects, but they are not subjective like Verboten. And judgment is a decision of an individual. I accept I accept something as true. So concrete judgment is a judgment of a subject. It is my assertion or my judgment that something is true. I defend it, but it is made by a judgment, but it's not subjective in the sense that I only know what I do. So others can understand my judgment too. So insofar, judgments, understand judgments as Entschlüsse, as Entscheidungen, decisions, are not subjective like Färbung, because Färbung is subjective. In Vorstellung is, as Frege says, you have different Vorstellungen than I have. And so far, Vorstellungen are subjective, but judgments as decisions are not subjective. So that I think that are two reasons why we understand Entschlüsse not in the same sense as Vorstellung, not in the same subjective sense. That is my argument. But perhaps later Mario can explain what he thinks.
He has a very nice paper that he sent to me.
I know. I heard him. He gave a lecture in Jena on this subject, so he knows better than I know. But these two arguments would be my arguments why Frege did not use Entschlüsse as kinds of Vorstellung. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. It's remarkable how little he says about Entschlüsse. As far as I know, it only occurs 3 times in his whole writings. Twice in Der Gedanke and once in a letter to somebody, I don't remember where. But could it be perhaps that Entschlüsse or decisions are the only door of communication between our internal world, Vorstellungen, and the outer world, in the sense that it's the only kind of subjective experience that has effects on the external world. All other sorts of ideas, representations, feelings, and etc., they cannot have any sort of effect in the outer world before they become a decision. So decision is something very, very special. It is private or it is internal, but it is what has Wirkung or effect on the outer world.
Yeah, that may be the case too. That may be another argument why he does not identify Entschlüsse as Vorstellungen. But I think my arguments are arguments too. So we have another argument. It is indeed, well, there is a argumentation by Frege when he talks about how thoughts have consequences in reality. So I think Frege means that even when I think about something that might have results in the external world, what do you think? We first have to accept thoughts as true or false, which we need to, that the reality becomes an external reality. It might be the case that already thinking might have results, not only assertions or judgments have consequences. But if you reflect something that might have, for instance, if you read poetry, that might have consequences for your acting, that you are impressed by some figure of a fictional work, that you say, well, you identify yourself with him or things like that. So if you read Kafka, for instance, that might influence your acting. And even in this case, it might be possible that there are influences in the real world only even by reading fictional works that might have results. But so I'm not sure that we need decisions to come in contact with the external world. I'm not sure. But let us ask Mario what he thinks. He knows much better than me.
Yeah.
Okay, at least that would be my answers to your questions that we have.
Okay.
Judgments.
Okay. Let me move to a different question now. Still in the phenomenon, the negation, there are two strategies that Frege uses all the time. Very interesting. He appeals to the pragmatics of asking questions and making and thinking about conditionals, right?
Yeah.
That's essential for him to say, well, here there are false thoughts, and false thoughts are very important for us. We are not asserting false thoughts, but he asking questions, which is a practice, a linguistic practice, and also conditional reasonings. Here he uses the examples of, criminal judgments and so on. If the accused was in Rome at the date of the murder, he could not, blah blah blah. So how is it in Lotze? Does Lotze have somehow this appeal to the linguistic practice of asking questions and making conditional reasonings as well, or is this totally original from Frege?
Well, in my paper, I said that Lotze in this case was not completely clear.
Okay.
So it seems to me that we don't find a decision concerning the question of negative contents. So I think Frege made it clear, and he was, I think, the first one. So, but maybe, well, I don't have the complete text of Lotze's logic and other books in my conception. I don't know. Maybe that there is a remark concerning this problem, but in fact, at the moment, I couldn't. I had the impression that Lotze was not quite clear about it. So I don't remember a passage where he clearly declares that negative contents are as well contents we have to accept. And by Frege, it is completely clear. So I can't answer your question. It's maybe that there are remarks, but I don't know them. I have to look into the logic once more. Okay.
Okay. I have another question. My fourth question is the following. You said that the notion of Verbung appears. Verbung, Frege talks about Verbung a number of times, most remarkably in Über Sinn und Bedeutung from 1892, and then almost 30 years later in the Thought, Der Gedanke. But in Über Sinn und Bedeutung, his talk about Verbung comes together with his notion of Nebengedanke, side thoughts. And it's not clear whether he sees Verbung and Nebengedanke as one and the same phenomenon or two distinct phenomena, right?
Yeah.
Maybe in the Der Gedanke, he's more clear. He says, well, look, Verbung has nothing to do with the... Yeah?
I think...
but in Über Sinn und Bedeutung, you think it's the same phenomenon or two distinct phenomena?
I think they are completely distinct.
Completely distinct.
Yeah, Nebengedanken, secondary thoughts, like other thoughts, are objective. Nebengedanken are objective as Gedanken. That is, the difference is only Nebengedanken are not expressed explicitly, but only implicitly. See, for instance, the discussion of presupposition. I think it is completely clear when you read Frege's letter to Husserl. There is a question: how should we understand the word all, everything? And he says that he does not imply with all the existence and Rather, he does not imply it as, does not understand existence as an implication of saying all. And it is not a Nebengedanke. The existence is not a Nebengedanke of all. So it is a thought, it is ein Gedanke, it is a thought. And it is an objective thought. It is not expressed explicitly.
Mhm.
So, for instance, his argument is we should have not a complex concept of everything. You know, for Lotze, he uses the same logical, das logische Quadrat, the logical square. So the question is whether the general judgment implies the particular to go the subalternen Schlüsse, subaltern implications. In the traditional logical square, they are valid. In Frege and modern logic, they are not valid. So everything does not imply einige, some. And that is a discussion with Husserl that Frege argues against the traditional logical square that all implies some in the sense of subalterne Schlüsse, subaltern implication. And here he says, we don't want to accept the existence as a Nebengedanke of the general proposition or general judgment. And it is clear that you understand the Nebengedanke wonderful. There's no problem. He argues against Husserl that he doesn't want to accept the Nebengedanke of existence neither as implication nor as presupposition.
Yeah.
And here we have as a Nebengedanke an existential, a existence predication.
Right.
And that is completely understandable. It has nothing to do with Färbung.
So would you say that Nebengedanke are Gedanke? They are thoughts not contained. But Färbung is something purely psychological. Would you say that?
Yeah. Well, I think Frege's position is that Färbung is completely subjective. I don't agree with him because some Färbung is only pejorative. His example of Hund and Köter, you know, that is, the Köter is pejorative. And I think we understand that. That is part of the sense. It is not only Färbung. For Frege, I think the tendency in Frege is all these things he wants to spell out from logic. But I don't agree. I think his concept of Färbung is very important. It is a tradition of, I called it already, the colores rhetorici. It's an old idea of the antique rhetoric. And Frege refers to rhetoric and poetry when he speaks about Färbung. But I think he is not right to conceive all Färbung as purely subjective, because we understand the difference between dog. I don't know the English word of Köter. I don't know whether this works in English. But in German, we understand the difference between Hund and Köter. And we understand the difference between Pferd and Ross. So it is an emotional part of the sense.
Right.
So insofar, I think Frege is wrong when he says that it is completely subjective. But for Frege, it is indeed. We have different Vorstellungen. Your Vorstellungen are not my Vorstellungen. That is how Frege argues. That is, Frege argues in one sense that there is a private language concerning, if we talk in the Wittgensteinian sense about it. For Frege, there is a private language. For Wittgenstein, I think, was right when he didn't accept it. And so far, in this field, I don't agree with Frege. But it is important that he mentions this aspect of language. But his characterization of purely subjective, I think, is not correct.
It is interesting in this connection, Gottfried, what you're saying, that maybe Frege is not right, because some of the examples that he gives of coloring or Färbung are examples that 100 years later, Paul Grice would give as a conventional implicature. So they are implicature, they are not part of the, they are not part of the official meaning, but they are triggered somehow by the conventional meaning. So it cannot be just something psychological. It must be something in the meaning.
Yeah, we understand it. And that means that is not completely subjective. Yeah. Okay.
Gottfried, I had some questions that I've sent you. Question number 5, 6, 7. But probably we are taking too much time, and of course we want to leave time for the public to ask you questions. So I'm gonna jump to my last 2 global questions.
Yeah.
I'm gonna jump at question number 8 and number 9. Question number 8, I've sent you the list, is why do you talk at the end of your talk? Why do you say, you mentioned at the end of your talk that Lotze is both an analytic and a continental philosopher? Because almost everything that you mentioned to us places Lotze in the heart of the analytic worries, right? There's no semantic notions, truth, logic, and so on. I don't understand why you take Lotze as a good example of integration between analytic and continental philosophy, because what I get from your writing is that Lotze is a purely analytic philosopher.
The problem is I use the distinction of analytic and continental philosophy, though I don't like it. I think it's wrong. It's wrong, especially if you understand what it means. Continental is a geographic word, and analytic is a methodological word. And it is the case that the most important analytic philosophies come from the continent, like Frege, Carnap, and Wittgenstein. And there is a deep tradition of German-speaking world, and that is what I mean when in the book I've written together with Sven Schlotter, I mentioned it. Frege und die kontinentalen Ursprünge der analytischen Philosophie. Hereby I want to provoke people. You see, the problem is that for people like Dummett, with Frege, real philosophy begins. He doesn't look in the old German books, and he did not accept Lotze as an important philosopher. So the problem is that the distinction between analytic and continental philosophy, I don't like this distinction. And my tendency is to show that the so-called analytical results are prepared already in the old German tradition, which nobody reads.
Right.
And that is a problem. And it is very important here that you have to read the original text and not the translations, because to understand the influence of so-called continental philosophy to so-called analytic philosophy, to understand these influences, you have to read the German text, the original text, because it's a question of, very often, I try to show it, it's a question of terminological identity, that they use the same words, and this you can't find if you don't read the original text, because in the translation, this history of concepts and terminology does not appear. You can't see the influence. Only if you read the original text, you can see here they use the same words. And I try to show it in some examples that I stress the point that there was a terminology, the same terminology in here and in the other sense. And the this shows that the old decision between continental and analytic philosophy, that is I think a bad distinction. We shouldn't. I use it because it is introduced, but in fact I don't like it because there is no this difference between one and the other one. There's a continuum.
Yeah. So probably what you mean is the analytic tradition in the continent.
That is what I want. What Plotter and me wanted to show in our book, because already the title says what we mean. Frege and the continental origin of analytic philosophy.
Okay, great. This brings us to my very last question. Why do you say that Kant won the battle regarding objects of reason? I mean, you say that, well, for Frege, his logicist program came to a disaster because he was trying to reduce numbers to extensions, or to, nowadays we would regard extensions as sets, right? But that was one particular attempt of reducing arithmetic to extensions.
What?
Doesn't mean that what came after Frege was unsuccessful. I mean, we have a spectacular success of Zermelo-Fraenkel's set theory, for example, in the axiom of choice. So I would say that I would be more like with Frege, like there are objects of reason against Kant, and what shows us that is the spectacular success and beauty of set theory, for example, not the Fregean one, which is contradictory, but the post-Fregean one. Yeah, that's very general and very.
So last question. I would say, no, I'm not familiar with the current developments in set theory, but I assume that numbers are not regarded as logical objects, and that is the point. The question of logical objects. I think Kant was right in his rejection of logical objects. But this does not rule out the possibility of a set theory without logical objects. It is better not to refer to Hilbert's. You referred in your question to Hilbert's paradise. Well, I think for a constructivist like Wittgenstein or Paul Lorenzen, Cantor's transfinite set theory is not more like a paradise, but more like the hell, because they would say transfinite set theory is completely nonsense. And I think Wittgenstein, the late Wittgenstein, thinks in the same direction in his philosophy of mathematics. So once more, I don't want to say, because I don't know what's coming out in modern set theory, it might be possible to reconstruct arithmetic in a set theoretical way, but I don't think that these authors understand numbers as logical objects in the metaphysical sense. That would be my answer. So it is independent. Modern results of set theory might be possible, but it's more a question. I want to ask you, my impression is that they didn't understand numbers as logical objects in the Kantian sense. And in so far, I think Kant is concerned metaphysical question whether these objects exist. How is it, the modern set theory? Do they use numbers as logical objects? I don't think so.
Well, the von Neumann ordinals, you assume the existence of zero objects, and then you have the empty set, and then the number one. Everything comes out from the axioms. Of course, it is it's a huge question whether this is logic or not. It has to do with the epistemology of set theory. We could go on forever talking about these things, but I would suggest that we open space for the audience to ask questions.
Okay. Yeah. Okay. Thank you.
Thanks a lot. Thank you.
Thank you for your questions. Okay.
Thank you, Professor Marco. We now open for the audience. I just would like to ask whoever wants to make a question, please come here because the camera it's over there. So please, otherwise Professor Gabriel won't see you. So to whoever wants to, please, Professor. Otherwise, he won't see you.
Should we make a little break?
Okay, here we go.
Do you want to take a break?
I would like to have a coffee.
Oh, okay, fair enough. I think it's fair enough, Professor Gabriel.
Coffee from you, but from my wife, perhaps.
What do you think about like
Only 5 minutes.
5-10 minutes? Okay.
Only 5 minutes, because you see my articulation becomes a little bit.
No, okay, don't worry about that. See you in 5-10 minutes, okay?
Minutes, huh? Is that okay?
No, it's perfect.
Okay. See us later. 5 minutes.
Everybody wants to take a coffee right now. So, thank you.
Ich verstehe im Moment nicht.
Okay. So
Max?
here we go. So is everything okay? Can you hear me?
I can hear you, but Marco, do you hear me?
Yes,
Marco.
yes, I can hear you. Yeah, I can hear you both.
Okay, great.
Okay.
So let's proceed to the questions of audience. And firstly, Professor, let me just, okay.
Hello, Gabriella. I believe we've met. It's Juliette Florent from Boston.
Nice
And
to
Marco,
meet you.
I can't remember. I've seen your house where you live in Jena.
Yeah.
So I just wanted to underscore how happy I am to see you attacking the continental analytic divide. This is very important to do. I wanted to say that Lotze has a very important role in afterlife in the American tradition.
Yeah.
So we also need to do the history of American philosophy from the 19th century on, and not forget the lessons that you are giving us about analytic and continental philosophy. I believe Lotze was the most popular philosopher read in the United States through the 1920s.
Yeah.
Because, of course, Americans could not get PhDs in philosophy unless they went to Germany.
Yeah.
So this is just to say I appreciated that spirit of what you've done. I was going to ask a different question, but then at the end, Marco brought up set theory and Wittgenstein, so I'm going to weave a little bit. I wanted to ask about this idea of the third realm in Frege and your worries about logical objects. Because when I teach Frege on the third realm, and I suppose in Lotze you called it a world of thoughts or a world of ideas, I always emphasize the Kantian background to the term Reich. And I don't know whether I'm right to do that, but since I have you here, I will ask you both. The concept of a Reich in Kant, if you read in, for example, I guess the metaphysics of, I guess the foundations of ethics in the Grundlagen, a Reich has to do with an area that is governed by law, by a consistent general pattern of laws. And so perhaps to save Frege a little bit, but maybe I'm being too nice to Frege, to save him from this Platonistic reading, we could emphasize that notion of a Reich, so that a logical object is an object that is governed by a set of laws. That is what the object is constituted by. It is not just a Platonic reality in heaven. It is something that is ordered by reason constitutionally, internally. And I would say something similar about set theory, Marco, because it's very interesting. I don't read Wittgenstein as saying set theory is nonsense. What I think he thinks is nonsense is something he learned from Frege, which is that the transition between, if you like, the intentional standpoint of a concept versus a set, that transition between the intentional and the extensional is very difficult and very subtle. And perhaps Frege went too easily over that slide. But the fact is, modern set theory, you must use the notion of extension to bring infinite objects into your reasoning. You have to erase all human procedures, or you can't have the notion of an actually infinite object or set. So there's no choice but to go for extensions. And I read Wittgenstein as simply emphasizing we shouldn't be confused that the transition between the constructivist, more intentional, procedural, law-governed idea, the transition from that to the idea of an extension in set theory is not a simple transition. It is a very big jump. And what Wittgenstein thinks is nonsense is not, of course, set theory, I think, but it is supposing that this jump is just a trivial thing. When we move from the idea of a constructive procedure to the totality of all possible procedures and get a set. And finally, this idea of Reich is maybe embedded in modern set theory because we have axioms. And the axioms govern the construction of the sets. They are subject to laws in that sense. So even though Frege and Wittgenstein don't talk too much or too kindly about Hilbertian axiomatics, still this idea is you're not just postulating objects in a Platonic realm that are logical objects in some trivial sense. These objects are governed by laws. So I place very heavy weight on Frege's use of the third realm as a Reich. And following your advice to read the original German, I would appreciate some help. Whether I'm teaching my students correctly when I tell them to think of Kant when we read that.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay. One question back. Do you agree that Wittgenstein wouldn't accept logical objects and that his idea, there might be classes, but I always read Wittgenstein as a constructivist concerning mathematics. So
I do think he would attack the idea of a logical object. That's very clear in the Tractatus on.
That is for him is metaphysics.
Yes, but whether this equals constructivism, I would argue against that a little bit. I've written a book with Felix Mulholzer, so I guess I have to argue with that a little bit. But certainly the constructivist attitude is one Wittgenstein is confronting said theory with.
Yeah. Okay. Concerning the Drittes Reich, I can mention that I wrote the article, the Historisches Wörterbuch der Philosophie, about Reich, Drittes. That concerns not only the logical Dritte Reich and the history, it's widespread, this idea of third realm in Kantianism and otherwise. So if you want to know how widespread this tradition of Drittes Reich is in logic and politics and so on, I can refer to this article in the Historisches Wörterbuch der Philosophie unter Reich, Drittes, the whole history of this concept. And the question concerning our debate is whether we can understand das Dritte Reich, and there are some positions who follow this line without becoming Platonists. That is an open question, I think. And I would like to interpret Frege more in the Lotzian sense, not accept in the sense I called transcendental Platonism. That is a Platonism which don't accept the Dritte Reich as a right of existent objects. Yeah. That I think that is a question how to understand some remarks Frege made, especially the late Frege in Der Gedanken, because this Platonism comes out more in the late Frege than in Grundlage Arithmetic.
Yes, thank you very much. I have more questions, but I'm supposing other people do too.
Professor Juliet. Professor Black. Thank you, Professor.
I want to listen once more to Mario, what he says about Entschlüsse.
Oh, let's fix that afterward.
Okay.
Professor Black.
Thank you. Good afternoon, Professor Gabriel, and good morning, Marco. I hope you are both well and fine. Thank you, Professor Gabriel, for your talk. And I have 2 points. The first has to do with a comparison between Frege's Platonism and Lotz's Platonism. I confess I never read a line of Lotz's works, but I just know that he was considered as a Platonist. But Frege's Platonism seems to me of a very special kind. Young Frege says that we need sensible science in order to think. And that was especially important for his justification of
is Begriffsschrift, is ideal languages. So standard Platonism can be reduced to two phases. The first is the existence of a domain of object that cannot be touched, seen, or tasted. And the second is the existence of an intuition that connects us directly to these objects. It seems to me that Frege's Platonism is not of that kind. There's the connection between the speaker here, competent speakers, and the thoughts are always mediated by our knowledge of the convention associated to science. So I would like to know, for the sake of curiosity, if there is something similar in Lot's Platonism. My second point, maybe you want to comment on the first point.
Yeah. Did I understand you that you want to know whether the Lotzian, what I called the transcendental Platonism, is in Frege too? So, did you want to ask whether Frege could explain in the same way as a Frege position, as a position of transcendental Platonism?
Well, I would like to know if in Lotz we have something similar to Frege's Platonism, that the idea that we are connected with objects of that abstract domain, so to speak, through our knowledge of the convention associated to science, which seems a part of Frege's Platonism. Is there anything like that in Lotz? Just
the position I wanted to explain is that Lotz's position is that we have to accept identity without entity. That means that ideas, Platonic ideas, are not existent, but only valid. That is the idea of Lotze. And this position, the question is whether this position, whether in this way we could analyze Frege as well. That means that we can interpret him in the Lotzian tradition as a transcendental Platonist and not as an ontological Platonist. That is a question I wanted to answer. But the other, and of course, the connection with language, I explain as a kind of anthropological fact. We need science. Also, did you mean by science the Wissenschaft, also sciences, natural sciences, or things like that? Or did you speak? I didn't understand, perhaps quite. Did you speak about science im Sinne von Zeichen oder im Sinne von Wissenschaft? Wie war das gemeint?
well, my second point is has to do with the separation between logic and ordinary language.
Yeah.
I had a conversation with Marco on this point, and I believe we both agree that there is something like a real interest in ordinary language in Frege. After all, he's spent a lot of time and work to analyze phenomena phenomena like truth value gaps, empty names, subordinate sentences, intentional context, things that are not in that do not appear in this vulgar shape. So there is a separation that appears clearly, but it seems to me that ordinary language is not just the villain of the story. There is a tradition that starts with Frege, that goes through the works of Alonso Church, Rudolf Carnap, up to Montague and today's formal semantics. It tries to apply part of Fregean legacy to ordinary language. So there is something, it has been understood that from Frege on, there is something that can be done to analyze ordinary language.
Yeah. I completely agree with this. That was a very important point in my lecture to defend Frege. What Frege says is that he wants a logical language, a Begriffsschrift, but that does not mean that die Sprache des Lebens, language of life, is not important. We have to distinguish both. If we do logic, we expel all these aspects of natural language. But if we try to analyze communication, how communication works, we all need these aspects. I think it's very important that Frege defends natural language as a language of life, Sprache des Lebens. And so, and I think that the remarks Frege made about natural language, when he says that it is not part of the Begriffsschrift, all these remarks are very important to establish a complete theories about this. So I think in this point, I completely agree with Marco, because Marco always defends all this difference between Sprache des Lebens and Begriffsschrift. That is both are important. So Frege does not neglect natural language, but he gives some hints how to analyze it. And so far, I agree with you.
Okay. Mark, do you want to comment?
Yeah, just to add something, Andres' question. I think from the very beginning, from his first work in logic, it is impressive in Begriffsschrift. It is impressive how careful Frege is to describe with precision a phenomenon that describes some aspects of language that he does not want to include into logic. Yeah. So, and the description that he gives is very precise and very similar to what we nowadays have as conventional and conversational implicature. So I like to use a metaphor with my students. Frege not only is a sort of surgeon that goes and takes out a cancer from a patient, but he gives a precise description of the cancer.
Yeah.
So in that sense, he anticipates a lot of contemporary pragmatics, but only a description of what he sees as a junk, as we are not going to incorporate this into logic, right? Yeah. A negative, so to say, a negative description. That's how I see it. Yeah.
But the negative description is so important that we can establish new theories on this basis.
Exactly. Yeah.
So we completely agree.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you to both of you.
Professor Chiara?
I'm Chiara Rosso-Kraus from the University of Naples. A very brief question. Since you started talking about Humboldt and Herder, and in these thinkers, of course, there is the idea that language is connected to thought, but also more generally to human spirit, to Geist, is an expression of the Geist. So my question is, when you speak about these later authors like Frege, and this idea of these subjective elements that are contained in language, is this subjective part of language like only an expression of the individual life, or it also conveys a more profound meaning? So it's subjective, but also as an expression of the human spirit, the Geist. Also because, of course, you said is Sprache des Lebens, but also the word Leben can be like interpreted in two ways, like the ordinary life or Leben. It is more like the Leben of the Geist. Thank you.
Yeah. I think Sprache des Lebens means communication, and so insofar we talk about communication, different subjects are included. I think that is presupposed here. This is not only an individual case of language, but it's generally. And I think, for instance, that is another point I already mentioned it. Frege very carefully discusses the difference between script and tone. That is very important, because if you compare it with Derrida, there's always this tradition that the oral language is a primary. And what Frege analyzes the relationship between script and tone, when he says we need the script for objectivity in logic, but of course the tone, the speaking language is for the communication much more important than logic. So even here, if he compares both sides, he always agrees that concerning the communication aspect, the Sprache des Lebens is very, very important. And it, of course, it is not reserved for any subject, but it is communication means that several subjects are included. Is that an answer to your question?
Like it's more about inter-individual communication, but it's not the expression of something like a Geist that bounds everyone together. It's just inter-individual communications. If I understand your answer correctly.
Yeah. Communication implies that there are several subjects included.
Yeah.
Okay.
Thank you.
Yeah, okay. Is that an answer to your question? Did I understand you quite correctly?
Yeah, I think it's an answer. So if I understand correctly, for Frege, there is not like a Geist that bounds these individuals together and that makes their communication an expression of this one Geist, just inter-individual communication. So there is like no almost a metaphysical Geist behind them.
It might be, excuse me, whether it's metaphysical, that's a different question. I think insofar concerning communication, Frege excuse me, I have to drink some water.
Welcome.
Okay. Thank you.
Okay.
Anyone else? Excellent.
Isn't Mario gonna say anything about Angelus?
Okay, we have just this final question, and then Mario. No, Mario's like playing humble, but of course.
So I'd like to say, firstly, thank you very much for the presentation. It was very nice. I enjoyed it a lot. Also, I enjoyed it a lot that you mentioned how you trace back Russell's antinomy to Lotz's warning, right? That you have to hypothesize entities, right?
Yeah.
And I really like how you connected that to the idea that Frege does indeed have ontological interest, right? Because that's an important thesis that goes against tradition that's really proud to see Frege as above ontological problems, right? So I really think it's important to see that in Frege and to correctly assign some interest to him. But I would like to ask, perhaps, if the same point also wouldn't imply that although Frege does have an interest in ontology, his interests and his dealings with ontology are somehow still very naive, right? So I would like you to perhaps comment on that, and maybe I'm using the word naive to spice things up a little bit, but maybe incipient or maybe not very thorough or not well thought out or something like that. Maybe this same point can that shows some interest from Frege in ontological questions might also be used to interpret his ontological position as somehow incipient or naive, right? I'd like you to comment on that, please.
Well, I think that Frege was very glad to accept logical objects because Frege had, I think, a metaphysical need and metaphysisches Bedürfnis. And that is, if you read these passages in Grundlagen der Arithmetik, when he talks about objects of reason, when he says that the rights, the arithmetic, the rights, that is an emphatic word, that is it shows when he analyzes how to understand logical objects in the case of numbers, he seems to be very glad that he has these objects. That is an interest of reason. So I don't think that is a general interest in ontological questions, but especially he wants to have objects of reason. So I think it's a first step in the direction of a new physics. Frege wants to understand logical objects in the sense of metaphysical objects. And that is the reason why he refers to Kant here and says, well, Kant was not right. I have here, and it is very clear that in Kant, logical objects are on the side of bad metaphysics. And Frege wants to realize that it is good metaphysics, that we have logical objects in the case of numbers. And so Frege, I think, for me, it's completely clear that here Frege follows a metaphysical interest, the so-called metaphysisches Bedürfnis, about which Kant and Schopenhauer and others discussed. And he has a metaphysisches Bedürfnis. And this Bedürfnis is realized in logical objects. That is the reason why Frege is so euphoristic and so glad that he has these objects. That is a metaphysical interest. And that does not mean that he is generally interested in ontological questions, I think. Especially these objects are the objects he is interested in. He wants ontological, logical objects. That is if you read these passages, he's proud of foundation of these ontological of these logical objects as part of metaphysics. And that is the reason why he refers here to Kant. Okay, is that a question?
Yeah, that's actually very illuminating. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you.
Mario, please come here. People are like thirsty for your approach on Entschlüsse.
Entschlüsse.
People are rooting for your
Vision.
Ich würde etwas vorschlagen. Ich schicke meine Texte zu Chiara, Susan und Judith. Ihr habt schon meine Texte gelesen und dann treffen wir uns online und diskutieren wir darüber. Weil sonst, es geht einfach um ganz konkrete Texte von Lotze. Ganz kurz erzählt, die Geschichte ist einfach so. Lotze ist eine entscheidende Figur bei dem Materialismusstreit. Und Lotze hat einen großen Einfluss auf Frege, nicht nur wegen der Logik, sondern auch wegen der Weltanschauung. Und Lotze war eine sehr entscheidende Figur in Jena, in dieser Zeit, als antimaterialistische Alternative. Nun, Lotze war ein Arzt und er kannte sich sehr gut aus mit Physiologie.
Ja.
Lotze konnte nicht leugnen, die Argumente von den Materialisten im Sinne, dass es in gewissen Fällen eine neurophysiologische Bestimmung von gewissen psychischen Phänomenen. Aber Lotze sagte, gut, das ist wahr, aber es gibt auch andere Phänomene, die nicht im Hirn lokalisiert werden können und die nicht einen Unterbau in der Physiologie haben. Und solche Phänomene sind die Phänomene der Freiheit. Wir sind frei, wir sind spontan. Und dann kam diese Theorie von Entschlüsse von Lotze. Das gibt es in Lotze, also eine geschlossene Theorie. Lotze, ja, das ist der Punkt. Das heißt, Lotze kommt wieder zur Vermögenspsychologie und er macht eine Neuformulierung. Und er sagt, naja, die Vermögenstheorie ist im Grunde genommen richtig, aber es gibt einen Punkt und dort muss diese Theorie korrigiert werden. Und wo ist der Punkt? Dass bei der Vermögenspsychologie Strebungen, Impulse, Triebe, Wille und Entschlüsse kommen zusammen. Und Lotze sagt, naja, wir müssen hier unterscheiden, weil es Phänomene gibt, die eigentlich zur Wille gehören, aber nicht frei sind, und andere, die frei sind. Und Lotze sagt es ausdrücklich, die sind Entschlüsse. Und wenn man diese Texte, die Marco Rufino zitiert, aus dem Gedanken liest, die Zählung, die Frege macht, ist kein Zufall. Er folgt genau die Unterscheidungen, die Lotze machte. Und gerade er sagt zum Beispiel, Strebungen sind Vorstellungen, aber nicht Entschlüsse, weil Entschlüsse frei sind. Ja. Und das ist der Punkt von Frege, ich glaube. Das heißt, Vorstellungen stehen unter Naturgesetzen. Und Frege sagt das mehrmals. Vorstellungen stehen unter Naturgesetze. Warum Entschlüsse keine Vorstellungen sind? Weil sie nicht unter Naturgesetze stehen. Warum sie nicht unter Naturgesetze stehen? Weil sie frei sind. Und Lotze sagt es ausdrücklich. Wenn es keine spontane Aktivitäten bei dem Subjekt gäbe, wäre es unmöglich, das Phänomen des Bewertens, das heißt, Werte zu schätzen. Und Frege wiederholt das genau in diesem Sinne bei der Logik in 1887. Es gibt in diesem Moment, in dem Frege sich auf Wundt bezieht und auf den Widerspruch von gewissen Formen von Idealismus hinweist, er sagt auch etwas anderes, das übersehen wird. Und das hat eine Beziehung zu Lotze und zur Theorie der Entschlüsse. Und Frege sagt, wie Lotze, man kann nicht leugnen, dass es gibt psychische Phänomene, die unter physiologischen Bedingungen entstehen. Aber es gibt so etwas wie 2 Schichten in der Subjektivität. Und das ist Lotze. Das ist die Theorie von Lotze.
Ja.
Und es gibt eine Schicht, die frei ist. Und es ist sehr interessant, weil bei diesem Moment in der Logik Frege bezieht das ausdrücklich auf das Denken und das Urteilen.
Ja.
Und es gibt andere Texte, wo Lotze ausdrücklich sagt, Urteilen ist Wählen. Ich weiß, dass Mark Textor hat eine ganze Theorie über die Anerkennungstheorie der Wahrheit und. Aber man kann nicht leugnen, dass es gibt 2 Texte, an denen Frege sagt ausdrücklich, dass Urteilen Wählen ist. Und das kommt zusammen mit dem, was Gabriel gesagt hat in Bezug auf die Beziehung zwischen Freges Urteilstheorie und die werttheoretische Urteilstheorie der von Windelband und so weiter und so fort. Aber das ist die Geschichte. Aber man muss ganz konkret die Texte zeigen. Das macht einen Sinn. Das heißt, man kann nicht spekulativ, warum Frege sagt, dass Entschlüsse keine Vorstellungen sind. Man muss auf die Texte achten und dann bekommt man ein gutes gesamtes Blick. Markus, du hast meine Texte nicht gelesen.
Ja. Also
Doch.
ich finde es wunderbar, Mario. Also mir war dieser direkte Textbezug zu Lotze eben, war mir nicht so bekannt. Also es ist vollkommen.
Markus tausende Texte von Lotze geschickt und er hat das nicht gelesen. Und dort ist ausdrücklich, was ich sage.
Doch, ich habe es gelesen. Deswegen habe ich dich provoziert.
Ah, ja.
Vielen Dank.
Das bedeutet ja, dass Frege von Lotze noch intensiver beeinflusst ist, als ich bisher gedacht habe.
Ja,
also mir ist
genau.
diese Stelle bei Lotze nicht so bekannt.
Das ist ein Beweis dafür, dass Frege Mikrokosmos gelesen hat.
Ja.
Höchstwahrscheinlich, weil der Ort, an dem Lotze diese Theorie verteidigt, ist im Mikrokosmos. Und fast alle in Jena hatten den Mikrokosmos gelesen. Frege auch.
Ja. Aber du würdest doch zumindest meiner Vermutung zustimmen, dass es auch die Urteilstheorie betrifft, weil Urteilsakte eben freie Akte sind.
Das heißt, Frege sagt es in der Logik.
Ja, nicht ganz falsch.
Frege sagt es in der Logik. Denken und Urteilen hängen nicht von physiologischen Bedingungen.
Ja. Okay, sehr schön. Vielen Dank.
Dankeschön. Okay, I think we have to finish this session. Saying thank you, firstly, for Professor Gottfried Gabriel. Wonderful. It was wonderful to have you here. And Professor Marco Rufino, thank you so very much. And for everybody here, thank you once again. And just to remind you that we have our lunch break up to 2 p.m., where we start our afternoon session with the lecture by Professor Chiara Russo-Klaus, and with the debating by Professor Ernesto Giusti, and afterwards Professor Sheila Tome, also in our afternoon session. So everybody's invited. Thank you so very much. See you soon.
Danke. Thank you.
I hope my problems with articulation was not too bad.
Absolutely not. Absolutely not.
I had some problems. I realized it, but that depends.
Es war prima, Gottfried. Es war prima.
War es verstehbar?
Ja, ganz
Ich hatte ein bisschen
einfach.
Probleme mit der Artikulation.